On the other hand, improvement in fitness is not dependent on the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype, it is dependent on the absolute survival of the particular variant. The probability of a beneficial mutation occurring on some member of a population depends on the total number of replications of that variant. The mathematics of improvement in fitness was described by Kleinman. 62. An empirical example of improvement in fitness is given by the Kishoni mega plate experiment. 63. In this experiment, improvement in fitness depends on the number of replications of the particular variant for a new variant to appear that is capable of growing in the next higher drug concentration region. Fixation or substitution is not required for this improvement in fitness. On the other hand, improvement in fitness can occur in an environment where survival of the fittest is also acting. Richard Lenski's classic E. coli long-term evolution experiment is an example of adaptation in a competitive environment, improvement in fitness during survival of the fittest. 64. The probability of a beneficial mutation occurring on some member of the lineage to give improved fitness is slowed by the competition. The variant which is a candidate for a beneficial mutation in this limited carrying capacity environment must first outcompete the less fit variants in order to accumulate the requisite number of replications for there to be a reasonable probability of that beneficial mutation occurring. 65. Competition. In biology, competition is an interaction between organisms in which the fitness of one is lowered by the presence of another. This may be because both rely on a limited supply of a resource such as food, water, or territory. 66. Competition may be within or between species, and may be direct or indirect. 67. Species less suited to compete should in theory either adapt or die out, since competition plays a powerful role in natural selection, but according to the room to roam theory it may be less important than expansion among larger clades. 67. 68. Competition is modeled by R.K. selection theory, which is based on Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson's work on island biogeography. 69. In this theory, selective pressures drive evolution in one of two stereotyped directions, R.K. selection. 70. These terms, R and K, can be illustrated in a logistic model of population dynamics. 71. Where R is the growth rate of the population N, and K is the carrying capacity of its local environmental setting. Typically, R-selected species exploit empty niches, and produce many offspring, each with a relatively low probability of surviving to adulthood. In contrast, K-selected species are strong competitors in crowded niches, and invest more heavily in much fewer offspring, each with a relatively high probability of surviving to adulthood. 71. Classification. 1. Directional selection, a single extreme phenotype favored. 2. Stabilizing selection, intermediate favored over extremes. 3. Disruptive selection, extremes favored over intermediate. X-axis, phenotypic trait Y-axis, number of organisms group A, original population group B, after selection. Natural selection can act on any heritable phenotypic trait. 72. And selective pressure can be produced by any aspect of the environment, including sexual selection and competition with members of the same or other species. 73. 74. However, this does not imply that natural selection is always directional and results in adaptive evolution. Natural selection often results in the maintenance of the status quo by eliminating less fit variants. 56. Selection can be classified in several different ways, such as by its effect on a trait, on genetic diversity, by the life cycle stage where it acts, by the unit of selection, or by the resource being competed for. By effect on a trait. Selection has different effects on traits. Stabilizing selection acts to hold a trait at a stable optimum, and in the simplest case all deviations from this optimum are selectively disadvantageous. Directional selection favors extreme values of a trait. The uncommon disruptive selection also acts during transition periods when the current mode is suboptimal, but alters the trait in more than one direction. In particular, if the trait is quantitative and univariate then both higher and lower trait levels are favored. Disruptive selection can be a precursor to speciation. 56. By effect on genetic diversity. Alternatively, selection can be divided according to its effect on genetic diversity. Purifying or negative selection acts to remove genetic variation from the population and is opposed by de novo mutation, which introduces new variation. 75. 76. In contrast, balancing selection acts to maintain genetic variation in a population, even in the absence of de novo mutation, by negative frequency-dependent selection. One mechanism for this is heterozygote advantage, where individuals with two different alleles have a selective advantage over individuals with just one allele. One mechanism for this is heterozygote advantage, where individuals with two different alleles have a selective advantage over individuals with just one allele. The polymorphism at the human ABO blood group locus has been explained in this way. 77. Different types of selection act at each life cycle stage of a sexually reproducing organism. 78. By life cycle stage. Another option is to classify selection by the life cycle stage at which it acts. Some biologists recognize just two types: viability or survival selection, which acts to increase an organism's probability of survival, and fecundity or fertility or reproductive selection, which acts to increase the rate of reproduction. Some biologists recognize just two types: viability or survival selection, which acts to increase an organism's probability of survival, and fecundity or fertility or reproductive selection, which acts to increase the rate of reproduction, given survival. Others split the life cycle into further components of selection. Thus viability and survival selection may be defined separately and respectively as acting to improve the probability of survival before and after reproductive age is reached, while fecundity selection may be split into additional subcomponents including sexual selection, gametic selection, acting on gamete survival, and compatibility selection, acting on zygote formation. 78. By unit of selection. Selection can also be classified by the level or unit of selection. Individual selection acts on the individual, in the sense that adaptations are, for, the benefit of the individual, and result from selection among individuals. Gene selection acts directly at the level of the gene. In kin selection and intragenomic conflict, gene-level selection provides a more apt explanation of the underlying process. Group selection, if it occurs, acts on groups of organisms, on the assumption that groups replicate and mutate in an analogous way to genes in individuals. There is an ongoing debate over the degree to which group selection occurs in nature. 79. By resource being competed for. The peacock's elaborate plumage is mentioned by Darwin as an example of sexual selection, 80, and is a classic example of Fisherian runaway, 81, driven to its conspicuous size and coloration through mate choice by females over many generations. Finally, selection can be classified according to the resource being competed for. Sexual selection results from competition for mates. Sexual selection typically proceeds via fecundity selection, sometimes at the expense of viability. Ecological selection is natural selection via any means other than sexual selection, such as kin selection, competition, and infanticide. Following Darwin, natural selection is sometimes defined as ecological selection, in which case sexual selection is considered a separate mechanism. 82. Sexual selection is first articulated by Darwin using the example of the peacock's tail. 80 refers specifically to competition for mates. 83, which can be intersexual, between individuals of the same sex, that is male-male competition, or intersexual, where one gender chooses mates, most often with males displaying and females choosing. 84, however, in some species, mate choice is primarily by males, as in some fishes of the family Syngnathidae. 85, 86. Phenotypic traits can be displayed in one sex and desired in the other sex, causing a positive feedback loop called a Fisherian runaway, for example, the extravagant plumage of some male birds such as the peacock. 81. An alternate theory proposed by the same Ronald Fisher in 1930 is the sexy son hypothesis, that mothers want promiscuous sons to give them large numbers of grandchildren and so choose promiscuous fathers for their children. Aggression between members of the same sex is sometimes associated with very distinctive features, such as the antlers of stags, which are used in combat with other stags. More generally, intersexual selection is often associated with sexual dimorphism, including differences in body size between males and females of a species. 84. Arms races. Selection in action. Resistance to antibiotics grows through the survival of individuals less affected by the antibiotic. Their offspring inherit the resistance. Natural selection is seen in action in the development of antibiotic resistance in microorganisms. Since the discovery of penicillin in 1928, antibiotics have been used to fight bacterial diseases. The widespread misuse of antibiotics has selected for microbial resistance to antibiotics in clinical use, to the point that the methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus (MRSA) has been described as a superbug because of the threat it poses to health and its relative invulnerability to existing drugs. 87. Response strategies typically include the use of different, stronger antibiotics. However, new strains of MRSA have recently emerged that are resistant even to these drugs. 88. This is an evolutionary arms race, in which bacteria develop strains less susceptible to antibiotics, while medical researchers attempt to develop new antibiotics that can kill them. A similar situation occurs with pesticide resistance in plants and insects. Arms races are not necessarily induced by man. A well-documented example involves the spread of a gene in the butterfly Hypolimnus balena suppressing male-killing activity by Wolbachia bacteria parasites on the island of Samoa, where the spread of the gene is known to have occurred over a period of just 5 years. 89, 90. Evolution by means of natural selection. A prerequisite for natural selection to result in adaptive evolution, novel traits and speciation is the presence of heritable genetic variation that results in fitness differences. Genetic variation is the result of mutations, genetic recombinations and alterations in the karyotype, the number, shape, size and internal arrangement of the chromosomes. Any of these changes might have an effect that is highly advantageous or highly disadvantageous, but large effects are rare. In the past, most changes in the genetic material were considered neutral or close to neutral because they occurred in non-coding DNA or resulted in a synonymous substitution. However, many mutations in non-coding DNA have deleterious effects. 91, 92. Although both mutation rates and average fitness effects of mutations are dependent on the organism, a majority of mutations in humans are slightly deleterious. 93. Some mutations occur in toolkit or regulatory genes. Changes in these often have large effects on the phenotype of the individual because they regulate the function of many other genes. Most, but not all, mutations in regulatory genes result in non-viable embryos. Some non-lethal regulatory mutations occur in Hox genes in humans, which can result in a cervical rib, 94, or polydactyly, an increase in the number of fingers or toes. 95. When such mutations result in a higher fitness, natural selection favors these phenotypes and the novel trait spreads in the population. Established traits are not immutable. Traits that have high fitness in one environmental context may be much less fit if environmental conditions change. In the absence of natural selection to preserve such a trait, it becomes more variable and deteriorate over time, possibly resulting in a vestigial manifestation of the trait, also called evolutionary baggage. In many circumstances, the apparently vestigial structure may retain a limited functionality, or may be co-opted for other advantageous traits in a phenomenon known as preadaptation. A famous example of a vestigial structure, the eye of the blind mole rat, is believed to retain function in photoperiod perception. 96. Speciation. Speciation requires a degree of reproductive isolation, that is, a reduction in gene flow. However, it is intrinsic to the concept of a species that hybrids are selected against, opposing the evolution of reproductive isolation, a problem that was recognized by Darwin. The problem does not occur in allopatric speciation with geographically separated populations, which can diverge with different sets of mutations. E. B. Pelton realized in 1903 that reproductive isolation could evolve through divergence, if each lineage acquired a different, incompatible allele of the same gene. Selection against the heterozygote would then directly create reproductive isolation, leading to the Bateson-Dobzhansky-Muller model, further elaborated by H. Alan Orr, 97, and Sergei Gavrilets. 98. With reinforcement, however, natural selection can favor an increase in prezygotic isolation, influencing the process of speciation directly. 99. Genetic basis. Genotype and phenotype. Natural selection acts on an organism's phenotype, or physical characteristics. Phenotype is determined by an organism's genetic makeup, genotype, and the environment in which the organism lives. When different organisms in a population possess different versions of a gene for a certain trait, each of these versions is known as an allele. It is this genetic variation that underlies differences in phenotype. An example is the ABO blood type antigens in humans, where 3 alleles govern the phenotype. 100. Some traits are governed by only a single gene, but most traits are influenced by the interactions of many genes. A variation in one of the many genes that contributes to a trait may have only a small effect on the phenotype. Together, these genes can produce a continuum of possible phenotypic values. 101. Directionality of selection. When some component of a trait is heritable, selection alters the frequencies of the different alleles, or variants of the gene that produces the variants of the trait. Selection can be divided into 3 classes, on the basis of its effect on allele frequencies: directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection. 102. Directional selection occurs when an allele has a greater fitness than others, so that it increases in frequency, gaining an increasing share in the population. This process can continue until the allele is fixed and the entire population shares the fitter phenotype. 103. Far more common is stabilizing selection, which lowers the frequency of alleles that have a deleterious effect on the phenotype, that is, produce organisms of lower fitness. This process can continue until the allele is eliminated from the population. Stabilizing selection conserves functional genetic features, such as protein-coding genes or regulatory sequences, over time by selective pressure against deleterious variants. 104. Disruptive or diversifying selection is selection favoring extreme trait values over intermediate trait values. Disruptive selection may cause sympatric speciation through niche partitioning. Some forms of balancing selection do not result in fixation, but maintain an allele at intermediate frequencies in a population. This can occur in diploid species with pairs of chromosomes when heterozygous individuals with just one copy of the allele have a higher fitness than homozygous individuals with 2 copies. This is called heterozygote advantage or overdominance, of which the best known example is the resistance to malaria in humans heterozygous for sickle cell anemia. Maintenance of allelic variation can also occur through disruptive or diversifying selection, which favors genotypes that depart from the average in either direction, that is, the opposite of overdominance, and can result in a bimodal distribution of trait values. Finally, balancing selection can occur through frequency-dependent selection, where the fitness of one particular phenotype depends on the distribution of other phenotypes in the population. The principles of game theory have been applied to understand the fitness distributions in these situations, particularly in the study of kin selection and the evolution of reciprocal altruism. 45. 105. Selection, genetic variation, and drift. A portion of all genetic variation is functionally neutral, producing no phenotypic effect or significant difference in fitness. Moto Kimura's neutral theory of molecular evolution by genetic drift proposes that this variation accounts for a large fraction of observed genetic diversity. 106. Neutral events can radically reduce genetic variation through population bottlenecks. 107. Which among other things can cause the founder effect in initially small new populations. 108. When genetic variation does not result in differences in fitness, selection cannot directly affect the frequency of such variation. As a result, the genetic variation at those sites is higher than at sites where variation does influence fitness. 102. However, after a period with no new mutations, the genetic variation at these sites is eliminated due to genetic drift. Natural selection reduces genetic variation by eliminating maladapted individuals, and consequently the mutations that cause the maladaptation. At the same time, new mutations occur, resulting in a mutation-selection balance. The exact outcome of the 2 processes depends both on the rate at which new mutations occur and on the strength of the natural selection, which is a function of how unfavorable the mutation proves to be. 109. Genetic linkage occurs when the loci of 2 alleles are close on a chromosome. During the formation of gametes, recombination reshuffles the alleles. The chance that such a reshuffle occurs between 2 alleles is inversely related to the distance between them. Selective sweeps occur when an allele becomes more common in a population as a result of positive selection. As the prevalence of one allele increases, closely linked alleles can also become more common by genetic hitchhiking, whether they are neutral or even slightly deleterious. A strong selective sweep results in a region of the genome where the positively selected haplotype, the allele and its neighbors, are in essence the only ones that exist in the population. Selective sweeps can be detected by measuring linkage disequilibrium, or whether a given haplotype is overrepresented in the population. Since a selective sweep also results in selection of neighboring alleles, the presence of a block of strong linkage disequilibrium might indicate a recent, selective sweep near the center of the block. 110. Background selection is the opposite of a selective sweep. If a specific site experiences strong and persistent purifying selection, linked variation tends to be weeded out along with it, producing a region in the genome of low overall variability. Because background selection is a result of deleterious new mutations, which can occur randomly in any haplotype, it does not produce clear blocks of linkage disequilibrium, although with low recombination it can still lead to slightly negative linkage disequilibrium overall. 111. Impact. Darwin's ideas, along with those of Adam Smith and Karl Marx, had a profound influence on 19th-century thought, including his radical claim that elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, evolved from the simplest forms of life by a few simple principles. 112. This inspired some of Darwin's most ardent supporters, and provoked the strongest opposition. Natural selection had the power, according to Stephen Jay Gould, to dethrone some of the deepest and most traditional comforts of Western thought, such as the belief that humans have a special place in the world. 113. In the words of the philosopher Daniel Dennett, Darwin's dangerous idea of evolution by natural selection is a universal acid, which cannot be kept restricted to any vessel or container, as it soon leaks out, working its way into ever wider surroundings. 114. Thus, in the last decades, the concept of natural selection has spread from evolutionary biology to other disciplines, including evolutionary computation, quantum Darwinism, evolutionary economics, evolutionary epistemology, evolutionary psychology, and cosmological natural selection. This unlimited applicability has been called universal Darwinism. 115. Origin of life. How life originated from inorganic matter remains an unresolved problem in biology. One prominent hypothesis is that life first appeared in the form of short self-replicating RNA polymers. 116. On this view, life may have come into existence when RNA chains first experienced the basic conditions, as conceived by Charles Darwin, for natural selection to operate. These conditions are heritability, variation of type, and competition for limited resources. The fitness of an early RNA replicator would likely have been a function of adaptive capacities that were intrinsic, i.e., determined by the nucleotide sequence and the availability of resources. 117. 118. The three primary adaptive capacities could logically have been 1. The capacity to replicate with moderate fidelity, giving rise to both heritability and variation of type. 2. The capacity to avoid decay. And 3. The capacity to acquire and process resources. 117. 118. These capacities would have been determined initially by the folded configurations, including those configurations with ribozyme activity, of the RNA replicators that, in turn, would have been encoded in their individual nucleotide sequences. 119. Cell and molecular biology. In 1881, the embryologist Wilhelm Roux published Der Kampf der Thiele im Organismus, The Struggle of Parts in the Organism, in which he suggested that the development of an organism results from a Darwinian competition between the parts of the embryo, occurring at all levels, from molecules to organs. 120. In recent years, a modern version of this theory has been proposed by Jean-Jacques Pupic. According to this cellular Darwinism, random variation at the molecular level generates diversity in cell types, whereas cell interactions impose a characteristic order on the developing embryo. 121. Social and psychological theory. The social implications of the theory of evolution by natural selection also became the source of continuing controversy. Friedrich Engels, a German political philosopher and co-originator of the ideology of communism, wrote in 1872 that Darwin did not know what a bitter satire he wrote on mankind, and especially on his countrymen, when he showed that free competition, the struggle for existence, which the economists celebrate as the highest historical achievement, is the normal state of the animal kingdom. 122. Herbert Spencer and the eugenics advocate Francis Galton's interpretation of natural selection as necessarily progressive, leading to supposed advances in intelligence and civilization, became a justification for colonialism, eugenics, and social Darwinism. For example, in 1940, Konrad Lorenz, in writings that he subsequently disowned, used the theory as a justification for policies of the Nazi state. He wrote, "Selection for toughness, heroism, and social utility must be accomplished by some human institution, if mankind, in default of selective factors, is not to be ruined by domestication-induced degeneracy. The racial idea as the basis of our state has already accomplished much in this respect." 123. Others have developed ideas that human societies and culture evolve by mechanisms analogous to those that apply to evolution of species. 124. More recently, work among anthropologists and psychologists has led to the development of sociobiology and later of evolutionary psychology, a field that attempts to explain features of human psychology in terms of adaptation to the ancestral environment. The most prominent example of evolutionary psychology, notably advanced in the early work of Noam Chomsky and later by Steven Pinker, is the hypothesis that the human brain has adapted to acquire the grammatical rules of natural language. 125. Other aspects of human behavior and social structures, from specific cultural norms such as incest avoidance to broader patterns such as gender roles, have been hypothesized to have similar origins as adaptations to the early environment in which modern humans evolved. By analogy to the action of natural selection on genes, the concept of means, units of cultural transmission, or culture's equivalence of genes undergoing selection and recombination, has arisen, first described in this form by Richard Dawkins in 1976, 126, and subsequently expanded upon by philosophers such as Daniel Dennett as explanations for complex cultural activities, including human consciousness. 127. Information and Systems Theory. In 1922, Alfred J. Lathke proposed that natural selection might be understood as a physical principle that could be described in terms of the use of energy by a system. 128-129, a concept later developed by Howard T. Odum as a maximum power principle in thermodynamics, whereby evolutionary systems with selective advantage maximize the rate of useful energy transformation. 130. The principles of natural selection have inspired a variety of computational techniques, such as soft, artificial life, that simulate selective processes and can be highly efficient in adapting entities to an environment defined by a specified fitness function. 131, for example, a class of heuristic optimization algorithms known as genetic algorithms, pioneered by John Henry Holland in the 1970s and expanded upon by David E. Goldberg. 132, identify optimal solutions by simulated reproduction and mutation of a population of solutions defined by an initial probability distribution. 133, such algorithms are particularly useful when applied to problems whose energy landscape is very rough or has many local minima. 134. In fiction, Darwinian evolution by natural selection is pervasive in literature, whether taken optimistically in terms of how humanity may evolve towards perfection, or pessimistically in terms of the dire consequences of the interaction of human nature and the struggle for survival. Among major responses is Samuel Butler's 1872 pessimistic Iruhan, Nowhere, written mostly backwards. In 1893 H. G. Wells imagined the man of the year million, transformed by natural selection into a being with a huge head and eyes, and shrunken body. 135. Notes. A. In sexual selection, a female animal making a choice of mate may be argued to be intending to get the best mate. There is no suggestion that she has any intention to improve the bloodline in the manner of an animal breeder. Reference. Fitness biology. Fitness, often denoted or omega in population genetics models, is a quantitative representation of individual reproductive success. It is also equal to the average contribution to the gene pool of the next generation, made by the same individuals of the specified genotype or phenotype. Fitness can be defined either with It is also equal to Fitness, often denoted or omega in population genetics models, is a quantitative representation of individual reproductive success. It is also equal to the average contribution to the gene pool of the next generation, made by the same individuals of the specified genotype or phenotype. Fitness can be defined either with respect to a genotype or to a phenotype in a given environment or time. The fitness of a genotype is manifested through its phenotype, which is also affected by the developmental environment. The fitness of a given phenotype can also be different in different selective environments. With asexual reproduction, it is sufficient to assign fitnesses to genotypes. With sexual reproduction, recombination scrambles alleles into different genotypes every generation. In this case, fitness values can be assigned to alleles by averaging over possible genetic backgrounds. Natural selection tends to make alleles with higher fitness more common over time, resulting in Darwinian evolution. The term, Darwinian fitness, can be used to make clear the distinction with physical fitness. 1. Fitness does not include a measure of survival or lifespan. Herbert Spencer's well-known phrase, survival of the fittest, should be interpreted as survival of the form phenotypic or genotypic that will leave the most copies of itself in successive generations. Inclusive fitness differs from individual fitness by including the ability of an allele in one individual to promote the survival and/or reproduction of other individuals that share that allele, in preference to individuals with a different allele. Inclusive fitness differs from individual fitness by including the ability of an allele in one individual to promote the survival and/or reproduction of other individuals that share that allele, in preference to individuals with a different allele. To avoid double counting, inclusive fitness excludes the contribution of other individuals to the survival and reproduction of the focal individual. One mechanism of inclusive fitness is kin selection. Fitness is propensity. Fitness is often defined as a propensity or probability, rather than the actual number of offspring. For example, according to Maynard Smith, fitness is a property, not of an individual, but of a class of individuals, for example homozygous for allele at a particular locus. Thus the phrase expected number of offspring means the average number, not the number produced by some one individual. If the first human infant with a gene for levitation were struck by lightning in its pram, this would not prove the new genotype to have low fitness, but only that the particular child was unlucky. 2. Alternatively, the fitness of the individual, having an array X of phenotypes, is the probability, Sx, that the individual will be included among the group selected as parents of the next generation. 3. Models of fitness. In order to avoid the complications of sex and recombination, the concept of fitness is presented below in the restricted setting of an asexual population without genetic recombination. Thus, fitnesses can be assigned directly to genotypes. There are two commonly used operationalizations of fitness, absolute fitness and relative fitness. Absolute fitness. The absolute fitness of a genotype is defined as the proportional change in the abundance of that genotype over one generation attributable to selection. For example, if is the abundance of a genotype in generation in an infinitely large population, so that there is no genetic drift and neglecting the change in genotype abundances due to mutations, then 4. An absolute fitness larger than 1 indicates growth in that genotype's abundance, and absolute fitness smaller than 1 indicates decline. Relative fitness. Whereas absolute fitness determines changes in genotype abundance, relative fitness determines changes in genotype frequency. If is the total population size in generation, and the relevant genotype's frequency is, then, Whereas the mean relative fitness in the population, again setting aside changes in frequency due to drift and mutation. Relative fitnesses only indicate the change in prevalence of different genotypes relative to each other, and so only their values relative to each other are important. Relative fitnesses can be any non-negative number, including 0. It is often convenient to choose one genotype as a reference and set its relative fitness to 1. Relative fitness is used in the standard Wright Fisher and Moran models of population genetics. Absolute fitnesses can be used to calculate relative fitness, since we have used the fact that, whereas the mean absolute fitness in the population. This implies that, or in other words, relative fitness is proportional to. It is not possible to calculate absolute fitnesses from relative fitnesses alone, since relative fitnesses contain no information about changes in overall population abundance. Assigning relative fitness values to genotypes is mathematically appropriate when two conditions are met. First, the population is at demographic equilibrium, and second, individuals vary in their birth rate, contestability, or death rate, but not a combination of these traits. 5. Change in genotype frequencies due to selection. Increase in frequency over time of genotype, which has a 1% greater relative fitness than the other genotype present. The change in genotype frequencies due to selection follows immediately from the definition of relative fitness. Thus, a genotype's frequency will decline or increase depending on whether its fitness is lower or greater than the mean fitness, respectively. In the particular case that there are only two genotypes of interest, e.g. representing the invasion of a new mutant allele, the change in genotype frequencies is often written in a different form. Suppose that two genotypes N have fitnesses N, and frequencies N, respectively. Then, and so. Thus, the change in genotype S frequency depends crucially on the difference between its fitness and the fitness of genotype. Supposing that is more fit than, and defining the selection coefficient by, we obtain where the last approximation holds for. In other words, the fitter genotype's frequency grows approximately logistically. History. Herbert Spencer. The British sociologist Herbert Spencer coined the phrase, survival of the fittest, in his 1864 work Principles of Biology to characterize what Charles Darwin had called natural selection. 6. The British Indian biologist J.B.S. Haldane was the first to quantify fitness, in terms of the modern evolutionary synthesis of Darwinism and Mendelian genetics, starting with his 1924 paper A Mathematical Theory of Natural and Artificial Selection. The next further advance was the introduction of the concept of inclusive fitness by the British biologist W. D. Hamilton in 1964 in his paper on the genetical evolution of social behavior. Genetic load. Genetic load measures the average fitness of a population of individuals, relative either to a theoretical genotype of optimal fitness, or relative to the most fit genotype actually present in the population. 7. Consider N genotypes, which have the fitnesses and the genotype frequencies respectively. Ignoring frequency-dependent selection, then genetic load may be calculated as. Genetic load may increase when deleterious mutations, migration, inbreeding, or outcrossing lower mean fitness. Genetic load may also increase when beneficial mutations increase the maximum fitness against which other mutations are compared. This is known as the substitutional load or cost of selection. See also. Adaptation. In biology, adaptation has three related meanings. Firstly, it is the dynamic evolutionary process of natural selection that fits organisms to their environment, enhancing their evolutionary fitness. Secondly, it is a state reached by the population during that process. Thirdly, it is a phenotypic trait or adaptive trait, with a functional role in each individual organism, that is maintained and has evolved through natural selection. Historically, adaptation has been described from the time of the ancient Greek philosophers such as Empedocles and Aristotle. In 18th and 19th century natural theology, adaptation was taken as evidence for the existence of a deity. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace proposed instead that it was explained by natural selection. Adaptation is related to biological fitness, which governs the rate of evolution as measured by change in allele frequencies. Often, two or more species co-adapt and co-evolve as they develop adaptations that interlock with those of the other species, such as with flowering plants and pollinating insects. In mimicry, species evolve to resemble other species. In mimicry, this is a mutually beneficial co-evolution as each of a group of strongly defended species, such as wasps able to sting, come to advertise their defenses in the same way. Features evolved for one purpose may be co-opted for a different one, as when the insulating feathers of dinosaurs were co-opted for bird flight. Adaptation is a major topic in the philosophy of biology, as it concerns function and purpose teleology. Some biologists try to avoid terms which imply purpose in adaptation, not least because it suggests a deity's intentions, but others note that adaptation is necessarily purposeful. History. Adaptation is an observable fact of life accepted by philosophers and natural historians from ancient times, independently of their views on evolution, but their explanations differed. Empedocles did not believe that adaptation required a final cause, a purpose, but thought that it came about naturally, since such things survived. Aristotle did believe in final causes, but assumed that species were fixed. 1. The second of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's two factors, the first being a complexifying force, was an adaptive force that causes animals with a given body plan to adapt to circumstances by inheritance of acquired characteristics, creating a diversity of species and genera. In natural theology, adaptation was interpreted as the work of a deity and as evidence for the existence of God. 2. William Paley believed that organisms were perfectly adapted to the lives they led, an argument that shadowed Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who had argued that God had brought about the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's satire Dr. Pangloss 3 is a parody of this optimistic idea, and David Hume also argued against design. 4. Charles Darwin broke with the tradition by emphasizing the flaws and limitations which occurred in the animal and plant worlds. 5. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed a tendency for organisms to become more complex, moving up a ladder of progress, plus, the influence of circumstances, usually expressed as use and disuse. 6. This second, subsidiary element of his theory is what is now called Lamarckism, a proto-evolutionary hypothesis of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, intended to explain adaptations by natural means. 7. Other natural historians, such as Buffon, accepted adaptation, and some also accepted evolution, without voicing their opinions as to the mechanism. This illustrates the real merit of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and secondary figures such as Henry Walter Bates, for putting forward a mechanism whose significance had only been glimpsed previously. This illustrates the real merit of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and secondary figures such as Henry Walter Bates, for putting forward a mechanism whose significance had only been glimpsed previously. A century later, experimental field studies and breeding experiments by people such as E.B. Ford and Theodosius Dobzhansky produced evidence that natural selection was not only the engine behind adaptation, but was a much stronger force than had previously been thought. 8, 9, 10. General principles. The significance of an adaptation can only be understood in relation to the total biology of the species. Julian Huxley, Evolution, The Modern Synthesis 11. What adaptation is? Adaptation is primarily a process rather than a physical form or part of a body. 12. An internal parasite, such as a liver fluke, can illustrate the distinction. Such a parasite may have a very simple bodily structure, but nevertheless the organism is highly adapted to its specific environment. From this we see that adaptation is not just a matter of visible traits. In such parasites critical adaptations take place in the life cycle, which is often quite complex. 13. However, as a practical term, adaptation often refers to a product, those features of a species which result from the process. Many aspects of an animal or plant can be correctly called adaptations, though there are always some features whose function remains in doubt. By using the term adaptation for the evolutionary process, an adaptive trait for the bodily part or function, the product, one may distinguish the two different senses of the word. 14, 15, 16, 17. Adaptation is one of the two main processes that explain the observed diversity of species, such as the different species of Darwin's finches. The other process is speciation, in which new species arise, typically through reproductive isolation. 18, 19. An example widely used today to study the interplay of adaptation and speciation is the evolution of cichlid fish in African lakes, where the question of reproductive isolation is complex. 20, 21. Adaptation is not always a simple matter where the ideal phenotype evolves for a given environment. An organism must be viable at all stages of its development and at all stages of its evolution. This places constraints on the evolution of development, behavior, and structure of organisms. The main constraint, over which there has been much debate, is the requirement that each genetic and phenotypic change during evolution should be relatively small, because developmental systems are so complex and interlinked. However, it is not clear what relatively small should mean. For example, polyploidy in plants is a reasonably common large genetic change. 22. The origin of eukaryotic endosymbiosis is a more dramatic example. 23. All adaptations help organisms survive in their ecological niches. The adaptive traits may be structural, behavioral or physiological. Structural adaptations are physical features of an organism, such as shape, body covering, armament, and internal organization. Behavioral adaptations are inherited systems of behavior, whether inherited in detail as instincts, or as a neuropsychological capacity for learning. Behavioral adaptations are inherited systems of behavior, whether inherited in detail as instincts, or as a neuropsychological capacity for learning. Examples include searching for food, mating, and vocalizations. Physiological adaptations permit the organism to perform special functions such as making venom, secreting slime, and phototropism, but also involve more general functions such as growth and development, temperature regulation, ionic balance and other aspects of homeostasis. Adaptation affects all aspects of the life of an organism. 24. The following definitions are given by the evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky. 1. Adaptation is the evolutionary process whereby an organism becomes better able to live in its habitat or habitats. 25, 26, 27. 2. Adaptiveness is the state of being adapted, the degree to which an organism is able to live and reproduce in a given set of habitats. 28. 3. An adaptive trait is an aspect of the developmental pattern of the organism which enables or enhances the probability of that organism surviving and reproducing. 29. What adaptation is not? The common kestrel has adapted successfully to urban areas. Adaptation differs from flexibility, acclimatization, and learning, all of which are changes during life which are not inherited. Flexibility deals with the relative capacity of an organism to maintain itself in different habitats, its degree of specialization. Acclimatization describes automatic physiological adjustments during life. 30. Learning means alteration in behavioral performance during life. 31. Flexibility stems from phenotypic plasticity, the ability. Adaptation differs from flexibility, acclimatization, and learning, all of which are changes during life which are not inherited. Flexibility deals with the relative capacity of an organism to maintain itself in different habitats, its degree of specialization. Acclimatization describes automatic physiological adjustments during life. 30. Learning means alteration in behavioral performance during life. 31. Flexibility stems from phenotypic plasticity, the ability of an organism with a given genotype, genetic type, to change its phenotype, observable characteristics, in response to changes in its habitat, or to move to a different habitat. 32-33 The degree of flexibility is inherited, and varies between individuals. A highly specialized animal or plant lives only in a well-defined habitat, eats a specific type of food, and cannot survive if its needs are not met. Many herbivores are like this. Extreme examples are koalas which depend on eucalyptus, and giant pandas which require bamboo. A generalist, on the other hand, eats a range of food, and can survive in many different conditions. Examples are humans, rats, crabs and many carnivores. The tendency to behave in a specialized or exploratory manner is inherited, it is an adaptation. Rather different is developmental flexibility. An animal or plant is developmentally flexible if when it is raised in or transferred to new conditions, it changes in structure so that it is better fitted to survive in the new environment, writes the evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith. 34. If humans move to a higher altitude, respiration and physical exertion become a problem, but after spending time in high-altitude conditions they acclimatize to the reduced partial pressure of oxygen, such as by producing more red blood cells. The ability to acclimatize is an adaptation, but the acclimatization itself is not. The reproductive rate declines, but deaths from some tropical diseases also go down. Over a longer period of time, some people are better able to reproduce at high altitudes than others. They contribute more heavily to later generations, and gradually by natural selection the whole population becomes adapted to the new conditions. This has demonstrably occurred, as the observed performance of long-term communities at higher altitude is significantly better than the performance of new arrivals, even when the new arrivals have had time to acclimatize. 35. Adaptiveness and fitness. There is a relationship between adaptiveness and the concept of fitness used in population genetics. Differences in fitness between genotypes predict the rate of evolution by natural selection. Natural selection changes the relative frequencies of alternative phenotypes, insofar as they are heritable. 36. However, a phenotype with high adaptiveness may not have high fitness. Dobzhansky mentioned the example of the Californian redwood, which is highly adapted, but a relic species in danger of extinction. 25. Elliot Sober commented that adaptation was a retrospective concept since it implied something about the history of a trait, whereas fitness predicts a trait's future. 37. 1. Relative fitness. The average contribution to the next generation by a genotype or a class of genotypes, relative to the contributions of other genotypes in the population. 38. This is also known as Darwinian fitness, selection coefficient, and other terms. 2. Absolute fitness. The absolute contribution to the next generation by a genotype or a class of genotypes. Also known as the Malthusian parameter when applied to the population as a whole. 36-39. 3. Adaptedness. The extent to which a phenotype fits its local ecological niche. Researchers can sometimes test this through a reciprocal transplant. 40. In this sketch of a fitness landscape, a population can evolve by following the arrows to the adaptive peak at point B, and the points A and C are local optima where a population could become trapped. Sewell Wright proposed that populations occupy adaptive peaks on a fitness landscape. To evolve to another, higher peak, a population would first have to pass through a valley of maladaptive intermediate stages, and might be trapped on a peak that is not optimally adapted. 41. Types. Adaptation is the heart and soul of evolution. Niles Eldredge, Reinventing Darwin, The Great Debate at the High Table of Evolutionary Theory. 42. Changes in habitat. Before Darwin, adaptation was seen as a fixed relationship between an organism and its habitat. It was not appreciated that as the climate changed, so did the habitat, and as the habitat changed, so did the biota. Also, habitats are subject to changes in their biota, for example, invasions of species from other areas. The relative numbers of species in a given habitat are always changing. Change is the rule, though much depends on the speed and degree of the change. When the habitat changes, three main things may happen to a resident population: habitat tracking, genetic change or extinction. In fact, all three things may occur in sequence. Of these three effects only genetic change brings about adaptation. When a habitat changes, the resident population typically moves to more suitable places. This is the typical response of flying insects or oceanic organisms, which have wide though not unlimited opportunity for movement. 43. This common response is called habitat tracking. It is one explanation put forward for the periods of apparent stasis in the fossil record, the punctuated equilibrium theory. 44. Genetic change. Without mutation, the ultimate source of all genetic variation, there would be no genetic changes and no subsequent adaptation through evolution by natural selection. Genetic change occurs in a population when mutation increases or decreases in its initial frequency followed by random genetic drift, migration, recombination or natural selection act on this genetic variation. 45. One example is that the first pathways of enzyme-based metabolism at the very origin of life on Earth may have been co-opted components of the already 44. When a habit 43. It is when 44. Genetic change. Without mutation, the ultimate source of all genetic variation, there would be no genetic changes and no subsequent adaptation through evolution by natural selection. Genetic change occurs in a population when mutation increases or decreases in its initial frequency followed by random genetic drift, migration, recombination or natural selection act on this genetic variation. 45. One example is that the first pathways of enzyme-based metabolism at the very origin of life on Earth may have been co-opted components of the already existing purine nucleotide metabolism, a metabolic pathway that evolved in an ancient RNA world. The co-option requires new mutations, and through natural selection, the population then adapts genetically to its present circumstances. 10. Genetic changes may result in entirely new or gradual change to visible structures, or they may adjust physiological activity in a way that suits the habitat. The varying shapes of the beaks of Darwin's finches, for example, are driven by adaptive mutations in the ALX1 gene. 46. The coat color of different wild mouse species matches their environments, whether black lava or light sand, owing to adaptive mutations in the melanocortin-1 receptor and other melanin pathway genes. 47. 48. Physiological resistance to the heart poisons cardiac glycosides that monarch butterflies store in their bodies to protect themselves from predators. 49. 50. Are driven by adaptive mutations in the target of the poison, the sodium pump, resulting in target site insensitivity. 51, 52, 53. These same adaptive mutations and similar changes at the same amino acid sites were found to evolve in a parallel manner in distantly related insects that feed on the same plants, and even in a bird that feeds on monarchs through convergent evolution, a hallmark of adaptation. 54, 55. Convergence at the gene level across distantly related species can arise because of evolutionary constraint. 56. Habitats and biota do frequently change over time and space. Therefore, it follows that the process of adaptation is never fully complete. 57. Over time, it may happen that the environment changes little, and the species comes to fit its surroundings better and better, resulting in stabilizing selection. On the other hand, it may happen that changes in the environment occur suddenly, and then the species becomes less and less well adapted. The only way for it to climb back up that fitness peak is via the introduction of new genetic variation for natural selection to act upon. Seen like this, adaptation is a genetic tracking process, which goes on all the time to some extent, but especially when the population cannot or does not move to another, less hostile area. Given enough genetic change, as well as specific demographic conditions, an adaptation may be enough to bring a population back from the brink of extinction in a process called evolutionary rescue. Adaptation does affect, to some extent, every species in a particular ecosystem. 58, 59. Lee Van Vallen thought that even in a stable environment, because of antagonistic species interactions and limited resources, a species must constantly had to adapt to maintain its relative standing. This became known as the Red Queen hypothesis, as seen in host-parasite interactions. 60. Existing genetic variation and mutation were the traditional sources of material on which natural selection could act. In addition, horizontal gene transfer is possible between organisms in different species, using mechanisms as varied as gene cassettes, plasmids, transposons and viruses such as bacteriophages. 61, 62, 63. Co-adaptation. Pollinating insects are co-adapted with flowering plants. In coevolution, where the existence of one species is tightly bound up with the life of another species, new or improved, adaptations which occur in one species are often followed by the appearance and spread of corresponding features in the other species. In other words, each species triggers reciprocal natural selection in the other. These co-adaptational relationships are intrinsically dynamic, and may continue on a trajectory for millions of years, as has occurred in the relationship between flowering plants and pollinating insects. 64, 65. Mimicry. Images A and B show real wasps, the others show Batesian mimics, 3 hoverflies and 1 beetle. Bates' work on Amazonian butterflies led him to develop the first scientific account of mimicry, especially the kind of mimicry which bears his name, Batesian mimicry. 66. This is the mimicry by a palatable species of an unpalatable or noxious species, the model gaining a selective advantage as predators avoid the model and therefore also the mimic. Mimicry is thus an anti-predator adaptation. A common example seen in temperate gardens is the hoverfly Syrphidae, many of which, though bearing no sting, mimic the warning coloration of Aculete hymenoptera, wasps and bees. Such mimicry does not need to be perfect to improve the survival of the palatable species. 67. Bates, Wallace and Fritz Muller believed that Batesian and Mullerian mimicry provided evidence for the action of natural selection, a view which is now standard amongst biologists. 68, 69, 70. Trade-offs. All adaptations have a downside. Horse legs are great for running on grass, but they cannot scratch their backs. Mammals, hair helps temperature, but offers a niche for ectoparasites. The only flying penguins do is underwater. Adaptations serving different functions may be mutually destructive. Compromise and makeshift occur widely, not perfection. Selection pressures pull in different directions, and the adaptation that results is some kind of compromise. 71. It is a profound truth that nature does not know best, that genetical evolution is a story of waste, makeshift, compromise and blunder. Peter Medawar, The Future of Man, 72. Since the phenotype as a whole is the target of selection, it is impossible to improve simultaneously all aspects of the phenotype to the same degree. Ernst Mayr, The Growth of Biological Thought, Diversity, Evolution, and Inheritance, 73. Examples. Consider the antlers of the Irish elk, often supposed to be far too large. In deer, antler size has an allometric relationship to body size. Antlers serve positively for defense against predators, and to score victories in the annual rut. But they are costly in terms of resources. Their size during the last glacial period presumably depended on the relative gain and loss of reproductive capacity in the population of elks during that time. 74 is another example. Camouflage to avoid detection is destroyed when vivid coloration is displayed at mating time. Here the risk to life is counterbalanced by the necessity for reproduction. 75. Stream-dwelling salamanders, such as Caucasian salamander or gold-striped salamander, have very slender, long bodies, perfectly adapted to life at the banks of fast small rivers and mountain brooks. Elongated body protects their larvae from being washed out by current. However, elongated body increases risk of desiccation and decreases dispersal ability of the salamanders. It also negatively affects their fecundity. As a result, fire salamander, less perfectly adapted to the mountain brook habitats, is in general more successful, have a higher fecundity and broader geographic range. 76. An Indian peacock's train in full display. The peacock's ornamental train, grown anew in time for each mating season, is a famous adaptation. It must reduce his maneuverability in flight, and is hugely conspicuous. Also, its growth costs food resources. Darwin's explanation of its advantage was in terms of sexual selection. This depends on the advantage which certain individuals have over other individuals of the same sex and species, in exclusive relation to reproduction. 77. The kind of sexual selection represented by the peacock is called mate choice, with an implication that the process selects the more fit over the less fit, and so has survival value. 78. The recognition of sexual selection was for a long time in abeyance, but has been rehabilitated. 79. The conflict between the size of the human fetal brain at birth, which cannot be larger than about 400 cc, else it will not get through the mother's pelvis, and the size needed for an adult brain, about 1400 cc, means the brain of a new The conflict between the size of the human fetal brain at birth, which cannot be larger than about 400 cc, else it will not get through the mother's pelvis, and the size needed for an adult brain, about 1400 cc, means the brain of a newborn child is quite immature. The most vital things in human life, locomotion, speech, just have to wait while the brain grows and matures. That is the result of the birth compromise. Much of the problem comes from our upright bipedal stance, without which our pelvis could be shaped more suitably for birth. Neanderthals had a similar. The most vital things in human life, locomotion, speech, just have to wait while the brain grows and matures. That is the result of the birth compromise. Much of the problem comes from our upright bipedal stance, without which our pelvis could be shaped more suitably for birth. Neanderthals had a similar problem. 80, 81, 82. As another example, the long neck of a giraffe brings benefits but at a cost. The neck of a giraffe can be up to 2 meters, 6 feet 7 in length. 83. The benefits are that it can be used for interspecies competition or for foraging on tall trees where shorter herbivores cannot reach. The cost is that a long neck is heavy and adds to the animal's body mass, requiring additional energy to build the neck and to carry its weight around. 84. Shifts in function. Adaptation and function are two aspects of one problem. Julian Huxley, Evolution, The Modern Synthesis. 85. Pre-adaptation. Pre-adaptation occurs when a population has characteristics which by chance are suited for a set of conditions not previously experienced. For example, the polyploid cordgrass Spartina townsendi is better adapted than either of its parent species to their own habitat of saline marsh and mudflats. 86. Among domestic animals, the white leghorn chicken is markedly more resistant to vitamin B1 deficiency than other breeds. On a plentiful diet this makes no difference, but on a restricted diet this pre-adaptation could be decisive. 87. Pre-adaptation may arise because a natural population carries a huge quantity of genetic variability. 88. For example, pre-adaptation occurs when a population has characteristics which by chance are suited for a set of conditions not previously experienced. For example, the polyploid cordgrass Spartina townsendi is better adapted than either of its parent species to their own habitat of saline marsh and mudflats. 86. Among domestic animals, the white leghorn chicken is markedly more resistant to vitamin B1 deficiency than other breeds. On a plentiful diet this makes no difference, but on a restricted diet this pre-adaptation could be decisive. 87. Pre-adaptation may arise because a natural population carries a huge quantity of genetic variability. 88. In diploid eukaryotes, this is a consequence of the system of sexual reproduction, where mutant alleles get partially shielded, for example, by genetic dominance. 89. Microorganisms, with their huge populations, also carry a great deal of genetic variability. The first experimental evidence of the pre-adaptive nature of genetic variance in microorganisms was provided by Salvador Luria and Max Delbruck, who developed the fluctuation test, a method to show the random fluctuation of pre-existing genetic changes that conferred resistance to bacteriophages in Escherichia coli. The first experimental evidence of the pre-adaptive nature of genetic variance in microorganisms was provided by Salvador Luria. The first experimental evidence of the pre-adaptive nature of genetic variance in microorganisms was provided by Salvador Luria and Max Delbruck, who developed the fluctuation test, a method to show the random fluctuation of pre-existing genetic changes that conferred resistance to bacteriophages in Escherichia coli. 90. The word is controversial because it is teleological and the entire concept of natural selection depends on the presence of genetic variation, regardless of the population size of a species in question. Co-option of existing traits, exaptation. The feathers of Sinosauropteryx, a dinosaur with feathers, were used for insulation or display, making them an exaptation for flight. Features that now appear as adaptations sometimes arose by co-option of existing traits, evolved for some other purpose. The classic example is the ear ossicles of mammals, which we know from paleontological and embryological evidence originated in the upper and lower jaws and the hyoid bone of their synapsid ancestors, and further back still were part of the gill arches of early fish. 91-92 The word exaptation was coined to cover these common evolutionary shifts in function. 93 The flight feathers of birds evolved from the much earlier feathers of dinosaurs. 94 Which might have been used for insulation or for display. 95-96 Niche construction. Animals including earthworms, beavers and humans use some of their adaptations to modify their surroundings, so as to maximize their chances of surviving and reproducing. Beavers create dams and lodges, changing the ecosystems of the valleys around them. Earthworms, as Darwin noted, improve the topsoil in which they live by incorporating organic matter. Humans have constructed extensive civilizations with cities in environments as varied as the Arctic and hot deserts. In all three cases, the construction and maintenance of ecological niches helps drive the continued selection of the genes of these animals, in an environment that the animals have modified. 97. Non-adaptive traits. Some traits do not appear to be adaptive as they have a neutral or deleterious effect on fitness in the current environment. Because genes often have pleiotropic effects, not all traits may be functional. They may be what Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin called spandrels, features brought about by neighboring adaptations, on the analogy with the often highly decorated triangular areas between pairs of arches in architecture, which began as functionless features. 98. Another possibility is that a trait may have been adaptive at some point in an organism's evolutionary history, but a change in habitats caused what used to be an adaptation to become unnecessary or even maladapted. Such adaptations are termed vestigial. Many organisms have vestigial organs, which are the remnants of fully functional structures in their ancestors. As a result of changes in lifestyle, the organs became redundant, and are either not functional or reduced in functionality. Since any structure represents some kind of cost to the general economy of the body, an advantage may accrue from their elimination once they are not functional. Examples: wisdom teeth in humans, the loss of pigment and functional eyes in cave fauna, the loss of structure in endoparasites. 99. Extinction and co-extinction. If a population cannot move or change sufficiently to preserve its long-term viability, then it will become extinct, at least in that locale. The species may or may not survive in other locales. Species extinction occurs when the death rate over the entire species exceeds the birth rate for a long enough period for the species to disappear. It was an observation of Van Vallen that groups of species tend to have a characteristic and fairly regular rate of extinction. 100 Just as there is co-adaptation, there is also co-extinction, the loss of a species due to the extinction of another with which it is co-adapted, as with the extinction of a parasitic insect following the loss of its host, or when a flowering plant loses its pollinator, or when a food chain is disrupted. 101-102 Origin of adaptive capacities. The first stage in the evolution of life on Earth is often hypothesized to be the RNA world, in which short self-replicating RNA molecules proliferated before the evolution of DNA and proteins. By this hypothesis, life started when RNA chains began to self-replicate, initiating the three mechanisms of Darwinian selection: heritability, variation of type, and competition for resources. The fitness of an RNA replicator, its per capita rate of increase, would likely have been a function of its intrinsic adaptive capacities, determined by its nucleotide sequence, and the availability of resources. 103-104 The three primary adaptive capacities may have been: 1. Replication with moderate fidelity, giving rise to heritability while allowing variation of type; 2. Resistance to decay; and 3. Acquisition of resources. 103-104 These adaptive capacities would have been determined by the folded configurations of the RNA replicators resulting from their nucleotide sequences. Philosophical issues. Behavior with a purpose, a young springbok stotting. A biologist might argue that this has the function of signaling to predators, helping the springbok to survive and allowing it to reproduce. 105-106 Adaptation raises philosophical issues concerning how biologists speak of function and purpose, as this carries implications of evolutionary history, that a feature evolved by natural selection for a specific reason, and potentially of supernatural intervention, that features and organisms exist because of a deity's conscious intentions. 107-108 In his Biology, Aristotle introduced teleology to describe the adaptiveness of organisms, but without accepting the supernatural intention built into Plato's thinking, which Aristotle rejected. 109-110 Modern biologists continue to face the same difficulty. 111, 112, 113, 114, 115 On the one hand, adaptation is purposeful, natural selection chooses what works and eliminates what does not. On the other hand, biologists by and large reject conscious purpose in evolution. The dilemma gave rise to a famous joke by the evolutionary biologist Haldane: teleology is like a mistress to a biologist, he cannot live without her but he's unwilling to be seen with her in public. David Hull commented that Haldane's mistress has become a lawfully wedded wife. Biologists no longer feel obligated to apologize for their use of teleological language, they flaunt Biologists no longer feel obligated to apologize for their use of teleological language, they flaunt it. 116 Ernst Mayr stated that adaptiveness is an a posteriori result rather than an a priori goal-seeking, meaning that the question of whether something is an adaptation can only be determined after the event. 117. See also: adaptive evolution in the human genome, adaptive memory, adaptive mutation, adaptive system, anti-predator adaptation, body reactivity, ecological trap, evolutionary pressure. Evolvability. Biodiversity is the variability of life on Earth. It can be measured on various levels. There is, for example, genetic variability, species diversity, ecosystem diversity, and phylogenetic diversity. 1. Diversity is not distributed evenly on Earth. It is greater in the tropics as a result of the warm climate and high primary productivity in the region near the equator. Tropical forest ecosystems cover less than 1/5 of Earth's terrestrial area and contain about 50% of the world's species. 2. There are latitudinal gradients in species diversity for both marine and terrestrial taxa. 3. An example of the biodiversity of fungi in a forest in North Saskatchewan. In this photo, there are also leaf lichens and mosses. Since life began on Earth, 6 major mass extinctions and several minor events have led to large and sudden drops in biodiversity. The Phanerozoic Eon, the last 540 million years, marked a rapid growth in biodiversity via the Cambrian explosion. In this period, the majority of multicellular phyla first appeared. The next 400 million years included repeated, massive biodiversity losses. Those events have been classified as mass extinction events. In the Carboniferous, rainforest collapse may have led to a great loss of plant and animal life. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, 251 million years ago, was the worst. Vertebrate recovery took 30 million years. Human activities have led to an ongoing biodiversity loss and an accompanying loss of genetic diversity. This process is often referred to as Holocene extinction, or sixth mass extinction. For example, it was estimated in 2007 that up to 30% of all species will be extinct by 2050. 4. Destroying habitats for farming is a key reason why biodiversity is decreasing today. Climate change also plays a role. 5. 6. This can be seen, for example, in the effects of climate change on biomes. This anthropogenic extinction may have started toward the end of the Pleistocene, as some studies suggest that the megafaunal extinction event that took place around the end of the last ice age partly resulted from overhunting. 7. Definitions. Shown in a museum, various models of species across various taxa and orders visualize the variety of life on Earth. Biologists most often define biodiversity as the totality of genes, species and ecosystems of a region. 8. 9. An advantage of this definition is that it presents a unified view of the traditional types of biological variety previously identified. Taxonomic diversity, usually measured at the species diversity level. 10. Ecological diversity, often viewed from the perspective of ecosystem diversity. 10. Morphological diversity, which stems from genetic diversity and molecular diversity. 11. Functional diversity, which is a measure of the number of functionally disparate species within a population, e.g. different feeding mechanism, different motility, predator versus prey, etc. 12. Biodiversity is most commonly used to replace the more clearly defined and long-established terms, species diversity and species richness. 13. However, there is no concrete definition for biodiversity, as its definition continues to be defined. Other definitions include, in chronological order, an explicit definition consistent with this interpretation was first given in a paper by Bruce A. Wilcox commissioned by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, IUCN, for the 1982 World National Parks Conference. 14. Wilcox's definition was, biological diversity is the variety of life forms, at all levels of biological systems, i.e., molecular, organismic, population, species and ecosystem. 14. A publication by Wilcox in 1984, biodiversity can be defined genetically as the diversity of alleles, genes and organisms. They study processes such as mutation and gene transfer that drive evolution. 14. The 1992 United Nations Earth Summit defined biological diversity as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species and of ecosystems. 15. This definition is used in the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. 15. Gaston and Spicer's definition in their book, Biodiversity, An Introduction, in 2004 is, variation of life at all levels of biological organization. 16. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, defined biodiversity in 2019 as, the variability that exists among living organisms both within and between species and the ecosystems of which they are part. 17. Number of species. According to estimates by Mora et al., 2011, According to estimates by Mora et al., 2011, there are approximately 8.7 million terrestrial species and 2.2 million oceanic species. The authors note that these estimates are strongest for eukaryotic organisms and likely represent the lower bound of prokaryote diversity. 18. Other estimates include 220,000 vascular plants, estimated using the species area relation method. 19. 0.7-1 million marine species. 20. 10 to 30 million insects. 21. Of some 0.9 million we know today. 22. 5 to 10 million bacteria. 23. 1.53 million fungi, estimates based on data from the tropics, long-term non-tropical sites and molecular studies that have revealed cryptic speciation. 24. Some 0.075 million species of fungi had been documented by 2001. 25. 1 million mites. 26. The number of microbial species is not reliably known, but the Global Ocean Sampling Expedition dramatically increased the estimates of genetic diversity by identifying an enormous number of new genes from near-surface plankton samples at various marine locations, initially over the 2004-2006 period. 27. The findings may eventually cause a significant change in the way science defines species and other taxonomic categories. 28-29. Since the rate of extinction has increased